US President Joe Biden announces his bid for re-election. We'll take a look at some of his key foreign policy challenges. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. President Biden announced his bid for a second four-year term in a video posted online, taking aim at what he called a threat posed by Republican extremists. The announcement set in motion the possibility of a rematch with former President Donald Trump. Biden, who would be 86 at the end of a possible second term, is betting his first-term legislative achievements and more than 50 years of experience in Washington will count more than concerns over his age. For more, we turn now to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. So Nathan, a new NBC News poll showed that nearly 3 out of 4 Americans don't believe President Biden should seek re-election. Talk to us about that and the case that he's made in this announcement that he wants another 4 years when this term ends.
Yeah, Joe Biden's always had a good line for this, I thought. He says, look, I'm not going to run against the almighty, otherwise God, but just the alternative. And the alternative could be Donald Trump here. And if you listen to his legend, essentially he wasn't going to run for president until he saw Donald Trump and what he said was destroying the United States. And that's why he ran last time. And pretty much the same thing is happening again with Donald Trump, the presumptive nominee of the Republicans. And also, let's face it, after 4 years of incumbency, where he's got quite a lot done, why shouldn't he run for another term? Well, the age issue is paramount. But again, he says, and I like the slogan because it's like, let's finish the job on the video. And essentially what he's saying is the same threats that he came into office on, Make America Great Again, radicalism. He showed video, as you can see there, of the January 6th insurrection, but also whittling away at freedoms, for example, women's right to choose, abortion rights, and other areas of why he has to run again. Let's take a listen.
Around the country, MAGA extremists are lining up to take on those bedrock freedoms, cutting Social Security that you paid for your entire life while cutting taxes for the very wealthy, dictating what health care decisions women can make, banning books, and telling people who they can love, all while making it more difficult for you to be able to vote.
Now, of course, the big problem for Joe Biden is the economy. We could be in a recession in the next few months. Could that last another 15 months? Well, even growth of 0 to 1% feels like a recession for most people. Inflation is still here, etc., etc. And very few American presidents, incumbents, get re-elected during times of economic malaise. But, you know, it is about the other guy as well. The latest polling has Biden running around 40% of approval rating. The last poll actually was 38%. But Trump polling lower at 34%. So even though the overwhelming number of Americans don't want Biden to run again, and that includes the majority of Democrats, even more people don't want Donald Trump. So you see it's a negative on top of a negative. I mean, that doesn't bode well for the enthusiasm levels of this campaign going forward, and you know it's going to be nasty.
Nathan, now we know that domestic issues normally, generally, are not on voters' minds when they go to the polls here in the United States. But there are some significant international issues around at this time. Could that impact the decision?
You know what? Foreign policy does not rate very highly when it comes to American political campaigns, does it? China doesn't get a vote. Other countries don't get a vote. But, you know, there are some issues here which are dominating foreign political discourse, and that is China. Remember, there is bipartisan support for some of these economic containment measures, as Beijing sees them, especially when it comes to high-tech semiconductors and things like that. Increasing talk of banning more investments. Of course, there's a TikTok ban potentially in the offing. So all this is going to be on voters' minds. And, you know, playing the China card always helps to whip up your base, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. And of course, the other major issue here is the conflict in Ukraine. Essentially, even though they've been backing Kiev for a year with tens of billions of dollars of weapons and lots of moral and other support as well, the gild on the lily is waning. The enthusiasm is waning here. Republicans increasingly questioning whether we should write a blank check, for example. Americans should write a blank check. And there's a lot of discussion, especially after the latest leaks that we've seen, intelligence leaks, about the narrative that Ukraine's about to win. Well, you can tell from behind closed doors, they don't think that at all. In fact, they're playing down expectations of this long talked about spring counteroffensive and feel that essentially there's going to be a stalemate. What if there's a stalemate at election time? What if there's a lack of peace talks? All these things could reflect badly on Biden as well. Remember, the incumbent can lose because of the state of the nation. Mind you, Donald Trump's already been president, and a lot of people didn't like that, that's for sure.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting from the White House. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Chidanand Rajghatta is the foreign editor and US bureau chief for the Times of India. Anton Fedyashin is a history professor at American University. Also with us is Aaron Maté. He's the host of Pushback with Aaron Maté on The Grey Zone. And Andy Mock is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Andy Mock, let me start with you. We heard Nathan King talk to us there about China. It remains one of the big challenges for the Biden administration. And as he pointed out, there's bipartisan support here in the United States for the policy of economic containment of China. The Biden administration's policy is summed up in 3 words: invest, align, and compete. But we did hear Joe Biden tell us in March of 2021 that he will not allow China to become more powerful than the United States. We look at the military posture on the part of the United States. In Asia, it has intensified. The BBC reported in February that the United States under Biden has secured a deal on Philippines bases to complete the arc around China. That is surrounding China. Will we see these tensions rise in the remaining time in the Biden presidency, and could they intensify?
Well, the danger is certainly there, Anand. The biggest risk, of course, is a military conflict between China and the U.S. And I think the key issue is, can China successfully deter the U.S. from escalating these tensions so that a military conflict does occur? I think it's also important to point out that this quote-unquote bipartisan support for being anti-China is perhaps a little bit of a mirage. So recently, Secretary of Treasury Yellen said that decoupling from China would be quote-unquote disastrous. And I think she meant disastrous for the U.S. So just like we've seen in these intelligence leak revelations, that what the government, the U.S. government, says about Ukraine versus what they really think is very different, that we may be witnessing a similar phenomenon here, that the rhetoric and the reality that is increasingly appreciated by the American government and American elites is that they must find a way to peacefully live with China, whether or not they like it or not.
Andy, what are we to make of the fact that much of the Trump-era restrictions that was imposed on China, I'm thinking mostly of the trade tariff restrictions, have been retained by the Biden administration, and in some cases, he's doubled down on them. If we look at chip technology, for instance.
Well, I think there's a couple of aspects to this, Anand. One is that how truly democratic is the United States, in that these two parties may not differ all that much, and some raise the specter of the quote-unquote deep state that actually drives a lot of these policy decisions. But I think also it's this misguided sense of American exceptionalism, that the world can only be a better place if the United States is number one, exercising its hegemonic power. And the reality on the ground, we all know, is shifting dramatically. China's development economically, technologically, diplomatically really is changing the world. Countries like Russia, Brazil also see the importance of greater autonomy and security from the weaponization of different things, from the financial system, military interventions to undermine governments, etc. So I think we really are in a very historic period of change here, and the U.S. is still struggling to adapt to that.
Anton, Fedyashin, one of the biggest foreign policy challenges that this administration faces, of course, is the conflict in Ukraine. President Biden has told us more than once that the White House will support the Ukrainians for as long as it takes. Those are his words. But is that a sustainable policy? I mean, we heard Nathan King tell us. What if there's a stalemate when the election takes place?
That very well may be, Anand. As a matter of fact, there's a noticeable attempt among the American journalists who are covering the Ukraine conflict in general, and especially the expected counteroffensive this spring or early in the summer. There's a noticeable trend of sort of toning down expectations for what this will achieve. And there's certainly a strategy of hope here in Washington that the Russians will sort of jump to the negotiating table, even if the Ukrainians, reconquer a small part of their territory. Hope's not much of a strategy. I found it interesting, though, in the video today, the Biden video, that foreign policy was almost totally absent. In other words, Biden's sort of playing on the strings that he knows the American population will respond to, and these are all overwhelmingly domestic concerns. This is no surprise in most American elections. The difference this time, however, is that the Biden administration has linked its foreign policy commitments, especially the one with Ukraine, to such a degree to financial interests, Western and, of course, American, more specifically, that one is beginning to directly affect the other. For example, the American invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq did not have the same kind of impact on the global economy as the barrage of sanctions that have been piled upon Russia. And the more sanctions are piled on, the faster de-dollarization is going to take place. And that will inevitably affect the performance of the American economy. We've come to the point where I'm losing track, frankly, of the amount of non-Western global leaders who are talking about simply following their own path in terms of currencies of trade and financial systems. Mm-hmm. This will have an impact on the United States. And that's one of those examples that you don't see terribly often in American history, where foreign policy decisions have very real impacts on the domestic stability of the United States.
Matt, I want to stay with some of those issues that Anton just raised. I mean, there are many people in the United States who are questioning the tens of billions of dollars that are being sent to Ukraine, especially at a time of economic hardship here in the US. And you add to that, there's been some great reporting that's been done by the American journalist Seymour Hersh. In fact, in one of his latest reports, he said that there's a lot of skimming going on at the highest reaches of the Ukrainian government of this aid that is being sent to them. At what point does the Ukrainian conflict become a significant domestic electoral issue? Or is it already?
I think it is already, and it will continue to be that way so long as Republicans continue to speak up more about it. And recently there was a statement from some senators on the Republican side saying that they're not going to keep authorizing these endless sums for the Ukraine proxy war. Prior to that, it was mostly Republicans in the House that were raising these kinds of concerns. And it's a fair concern to raise because this is as your guests have pointed out, a very impactful proxy war on the global economy that's inevitably hurting Americans as well. And people see the contrast between shipping tens of billions of dollars off to Ukraine while at home we can't take care of people in East Palestine. We can't give people health care. There's a major homeless crisis in multiple major cities. And eventually that becomes hard to sustain, especially now that we have these leaks from the Pentagon, which show that we're getting a much different picture of the war in Ukraine in public than the Pentagon is acknowledging in private. In private, they're saying that the best prospect for Ukraine is likely a stalemate and that Ukraine likely cannot win back more territory. But yet publicly, the Biden administration is telling us that, we have to wait till this counteroffensive in the spring by Ukraine. We have to support them for as long as it takes. What they really mean by that operationally is that we have to fuel the war for as long as we can get away with it politically. And so far, the Biden administration that's been their policy. But I do think as the election gets closer, that will be more difficult.
Aaron, those Pentagon leaks that you're talking about, they tell us, as you point out, a very different story from what the Biden administration has been telling us in public. Does that mean that the administration has been lying to us, or is that perhaps a bit too strong?
When Defense Secretary Austin tells Congress that Ukraine is doing well on the battlefield and that we're feeling optimistic about their chances of success, I do think that's a lie, because I think he reads the same intelligence assessments that the public got through the Pentagon leaks. And so, yes, I do think at minimum you can say that the Biden administration has been deceitful, if not outright lied. But that's par for the course. I mean, this is how war is waged. I mean, the war in Iraq, that was based on a lie, as has every subsequent war since. I mean, the war in Afghanistan went on for 2 decades with multiple administrations telling us that the U.S. was on the march, that the Taliban was almost defeated, and then finally we all know what happened when the Biden administration pulled out. And by the way, if there was a talk earlier about how Biden is not mentioning foreign policy. If he wanted to actually own a foreign policy achievement, he could point out that for all the flaws that came with it, he did withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and that is something significant.
Chidanand, let's talk about U.S. policy on India. India, of course, is a member of the Quad, which is an anti-China alliance, which groups India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. But India has also very successfully, I think, straddled the sort of ideological divide. It hasn't taken one side fully or the other. I mean, but when it comes to the relationship with the United States, do you see that growing?
Absolutely, Anand. India has tradition of bipartisan support in the U.S. Relations were great during the Obama years. They improved during the Trump years. They've gotten better during the Biden years. And likewise, U.S. also has had good relations with whatever party comes to power in India. That's the way two large democracies work. But Anand, just for a moment, I want to drag you back to the timeline of this election. There is 1.5 years to go before elections. I mean, elections are on November 5, 2024. There's 1 year and 191 days to go before that. And so much could happen in this time. In fact, it strikes me that, before U.S. gets into the presidential election day in 2024, November, India would already have had a general election. So you may have a new prime minister or Narendra Modi winning a third term. And so much could happen on the Russia-Ukraine front, on the China-Taiwan front, domestically, Trump with his legal cases, on Biden's own health. I mean, to me, it's astonishing. There is no country on this planet which has an election cycle so extended and so expensive, billions of dollars spent. So whatever we say today, and you'll be hosting many heats, I believe, between now and election day. So yeah, a lot could change, but in the big picture, you step back, as far as India is concerned, it's got excellent relations with both parties in the U.S. So whether it's Mr. Biden a second term or if Mr. Trump comes back, I don't think it makes any great difference. And I think a lot of countries across the world, particularly democracies, have learned to deal with presidents from both parties. So I don't see that being a major change. But in terms of red hot foreign policy issues, particularly wars, sure, you could see a lot of changes. Conceivably, Mr. Biden will continue throwing money into Ukraine, as you mentioned. It's possible that if Mr. Trump comes to power, he'll throw Ukraine under the bus. So those kind of things will change. On China, I think there is fairly common ground between the two prospective candidates. Both of them want to be tough on China. It's fashionable in the U.S. these days to blame everything on China. So that is going to be, something which will be, which will play out over the next year and a half. But on almost every other front, I see, things could change.
Andy Mock, I mean, we hear a lot about the differences between China and the United States, but do you think there are areas where these two sides could cooperate?
There absolutely are areas that China and the U.S. can cooperate and need to cooperate. So, of course, as the two biggest economies in the world, both technological powerhouses, there's so much good that can come from these two countries working together. And I think China has been very consistent over the years, if not decades, that it is ready to work with any country that there are no requirements or demands for shared values. The only thing is that a commitment to building a shared future, a better shared future for mankind. And I think this is a much more mature and judicious approach. And then the question, of course, is can the U.S. again adapt to these new realities? And I just want to briefly talk about Biden's reelection bid. I think that on every level, this is not a good look for the U.S. The Democratic Party really does not support him. I think the numbers I saw is about half of Democrats do not want him to run again. He has very low approval ratings in the countries we've heard. But more importantly, globally, many leaders in the global South say that when China comes to visit, they get a new bridge or a new hospital. When the U.S. comes, they get a lecture. And now with this deja vu all over again, it seems, in 2024, those lectures might be less valuable as well.
But there is a feeling, Andy Mock, that, the Biden camp feels that they're the ones who could defeat Trump again.
Well, this is an incredibly polarizing question, Anand. Now, of course, there are a lot of Democrats who do see Trump and the ultra MAGA crowd as the personification of evil. But similarly, there are many red state Americans that are very, very unhappy, anxious, alarmed about a lot of the policies the Biden administration is pursuing. They look at crime in urban cities, the so-called border crisis, inflation. They feel like the U.S. is going over a cliff, and if not Trump, someone like him are the only people that can save the United States. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
Aaron Mattei, it would seem that under the Biden administration, that America's influence around the world has decreased. I mean, if we look, for instance, at the relationship with Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, it's not what it used to be. This was a staunch ally. I don't think we could call it a staunch ally anymore. If we look at the relationship with Israel, there are tensions between the United States and Israel right now. There is a feeling in many parts of the global South that the United States cannot be trusted, and that happened because of the manner in which the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia during the Ukraine conflict. There's a move away from using the United States dollar as a reserve currency. Has U.S. influence decreased significantly under the Biden administration?
I think it has. An example of that came recently when the director of the CIA, William Burns, went over to Saudi Arabia and told Riyadh that the U.S. was very frustrated that Saudi Arabia was talking to Iran and Syria, two governments that are heavily targeted by U.S. sanctions. And in the case of Syria, a 10-year-long proxy war. And Saudi Arabia has been one of the most dependable allies of the U.S. in the Middle East. In fact, against Syria, they were allies in the dirty war there. So that right there, as you mentioned, is a stark example of U.S. influence waning. And I think that's a product of a couple of things. People are realizing that because of the U.S. control of the financial system, as was mentioned earlier, the U.S., when it wants to, can turn on anyone it wants and sanction you and undermine your economy. And people realize that for their long-term stability, that's not a healthy relationship to have. And so they're increasingly turning to developing alternative currencies and strengthening their own currencies. And then you look at the proxy war in Ukraine, where you see an example of what it takes to be a U.S. ally, which is in the case of Ukraine, Ukraine, I think, is being used to weaken Russia, as Lloyd Austin said. That's the U.S. goal in Ukraine, not to defend Ukraine, but to weaken Russia. So accordingly, if you're a U.S. ally and you realize how expendable you are, not seen as an ally, but is seen as a country that's expendable insofar as you can serve U.S. hegemonic goals, I think you're going to revisit that relationship.
Anton, I've just got a few minutes left, but I want to address this. There was a foreign policy op-ed in The Guardian written by Simon Tesdell recently, and he wrote that Biden's division of the world into for us or against us carries uncomfortable echoes of George W. Bush. That it is America's manifest destiny to defend and promote democracy everywhere. Do you think those kind of sentiments resonate with American voters?
They do resonate with American voters. The America First message always has, and frankly, I don't see why it wouldn't. The U.S. is a great power, at least some call it a superpower. It would be strange if the American public, did someone else's bidding. I don't see much of a difference, by the way, between Trump's commitment to America First and Biden's or that of any other president. The style of expressing this sentiment is different, but the essence is the same. The question is, how do you apply this, and whether you pursue a nuanced and intelligent foreign policy in order to achieve your goals, or whether you use sanctions, financial bludgeons, and threats. And unfortunately, the balance has swung in favor of the more blunt instruments of international relations and away from the nuanced, intelligent, discriminating foreign policy that the United States has at certain times in its history rightly been commended for.
Right. Chidanand, we have just a little bit of time left, but I want to talk about a piece that was published in the Financial Times today, an op-ed piece, and the headline of that piece was "No Cakewalk for Biden Against Trump." It points to his age and also the fact that there is a significant risk of a recession taking place in the next 9 to 12 months. How big are these issues going to be looking ahead to the election in 2024?
Very big. Obviously, the economy is going to be the number one issue. We spoke a lot about foreign policy, but at the end of the day, it's, the economy which will determine the election. But also, Anand, we also have to wonder what image this is projecting. I keep thinking, it's not like, Biden is 80, but Trump is not very much younger, 76. They'll both be, 82 and 86 if they win and finish a second term. And you have to wonder, because worldwide, the leadership is getting younger, actually. And if you look at Europe, Rishi Sunak is what, 50, in his 40s?
I think he's 43.
Macron is 45. There was a time in the United States, Americans would laugh at, the leadership in communist countries, the Soviet Union, Brezhnev and Andropov were all geriatrics, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And look how swiftly things have changed. And, the world is now having to deal with geriatrics leading America. Okay,
that's where we have to leave it. I'm afraid time's caught up with us again. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C.